I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And Laila Lalami, I am so happy to see you. I've been reading you for more than a minute, and this is your new novel. It's your 6th book. This after you were tapped for the National Book Award, you were tapped for the Pulitzer. I am hoping those finalist designations become, winner of. But, The Dream Hotel is here, and it is pretty different from the books that came before it. Mm-hmm. I am super excited for readers to get their hands on it, but I will also say that you and I will be spoiler-free in this conversation because you do all sorts of great twisty things in this book that we are not giving up in this conversation. I'm so happy to see you, though. Thanks for making the time.
Thank you so much for having me. How long have we known each other, Miwa?
I feel like a long time.
I feel like, it's been
maybe before you got to Pantheon? I don't know, because I've been reading you a really, really long time.
Yeah.
So, I mean...
Sounds about right.
I'm just happy whenever there's a new book with your name on it. Also because you do such different things between books. But The Dream Hotel is a little, it's super timely in ways that I wasn't necessarily expecting. And I say this as a person who, does spend more time on her cell phone than possibly a normal person. I mean, I even use it to get into the subway in New York. But I'm wondering when this book started for you. I love Sarah, who's our main character, and we'll come back to her. But... When did you start writing The Dream Hotel?
So the book started in 2014. I was having trouble getting out of bed one morning, and the first thing I did was I reached for my phone to check the time because I knew I had overslept. And I saw a Google notification that said, if you leave right now, you will make it to Yoga Works at 7:28. Mm-hmm. Now, I had never told Google what day of the week, what time of day, or even that I went to yoga. And somehow the company had followed my movements and learned my habits and knew that every Tuesday and Thursday, I went to the first class at 7:30. Mm-hmm. In fact, actually, it probably even knew that I dropped off my kid on the way to this class. So it knew quite a lot. And I found that just disturbing and frankly creepy. Mm-hmm. And I turned to my husband and I said, pretty soon the only privacy any of us will have left will be in our dreams. And then I thought, wait, what if, someday this sort of world of data collection penetrates our dreams? And I thought the idea was exciting immediately when I had it. Just because dreams are such a interesting world, right? Like it's a world that has actually a lot in common with the world of fiction. Just because dreams often take the form of narratives, and sometimes that narrative can be very loose, just a collection of images that somehow relate to each other, feelings, emotions that kind of are loosely connected. But sometimes it can be very tightly plotted, very twisty, very thrilling, suspenseful, what have you. So I just love the idea of putting this world of like dreams, which is emotional and instinctual, kind of in conversation and in conflict with the world of technology, which I think of as numerical and hard and logical, and sort of putting those two things together in fiction thrilled me. And so I thought, that's something I would like to be, to write and to explore in fiction. So that's how it started.
And there's so many writers, too, who sort of use those few moments after they first wake up to sort of interrogate their dreams. And I suspect you might be one of them. But the idea that you can wander freely in your own mind and suddenly that is the thing that becomes lost to you. Mm-hmm. And I wrestle with this all the time. I mean, I live in a world where, I participate in social media. And again, I have cell phones and I use email. And there was a moment where Google was sending sort of weird ads about meeting singles. And I was like, okay. A lot of stuff where I had not opted out, but I certainly had not opted in. And terms of service, right? Like... None of us read them.
Nobody does. I mean, it's ridiculous. Yeah.
And it's a great way for us to sort of get a hold of Sarah, Sarah's sort of walking us through this story. And I love this character. She is so real to me. She's an archivist at the Getty Center in Los Angeles. She is pulled out of line at an airport and sent to a facility because her risk score has been determined to be too high. And as someone who flies a lot and spends a lot of time in lines at airports, it's quite plausible. It's all quite plausible.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I tried in kind of starting the novel to start it from a point of exactly as you say, plausibility. In conceiving Sarah, I wanted a character very much like you and me, someone who is not a Luddite, but rather uses technology. You know, I believe me, I've been reading about surveillance technology for 10 years. That hasn't stopped me, for example, from getting TSA pre-check. You know, it's just the convenience of being able to get through the line. I travel a lot. It just takes, you know, and you do the same thing.
Yep.
So I wanted this character to have this kind of ease with technology, because I have a certain ease with technology, as you do. But I also have a lot of misgivings. So I wanted to put her in a situation where she finally confronts kind of, you know, what all of these actions really mean, and the kind of data she has sacrificed, and what that means for her sense of herself,
right,
in a deep way.
I mean, I go through my apps and I turn off the teach AI thing. Yeah. We all do it. And yet there are still times where things pop as advertisements in my social media where I'm like, I'm absolutely sure I turned off the microphone on my phone, so I'm not entirely sure what level the algorithm is working at. And I will also play with the algorithm, and I will, you know, like certain things to see if that triggers movement in certain ways, or I will, you know, pass by things because I'm like, I do not want to see more of that. There's a certain kind of media literacy in a way that goes with being kind of perpetually online. And in a lot of ways, we've pushed writers online in a way that you did not previously need to be. I mean, we've lost all of these book review outlets. We've lost radio. We have lost all sorts of ways for books to connect with readers. And now we're sort of asking you guys to do it. And part of what you're really great at is sitting in a room making stuff up. And you and Sarah both are navigating sort of what's personal, what's public, what's private, what is the thing I can hold on to and not necessarily give up.
I mean, I think about that question constantly. I mean, as you know, I was born and raised in Morocco. And so, you know, I mean, I remember being a child and, you know, if anybody said something that was politically risky, everybody's voices would drop and be like, shh, the walls have ears. Careful, the neighbors are going to hear you. So it's a matter of just, you know, grave concern to me that we now have willingly use these devices that actually do know, for example, in this case, our political inclinations. They do know that. And so I do think about that question of privacy a lot. But I think more than that, I think about what it's doing to our sense of self. Like, you know, we know that surveillance changes behavior or modifies behavior, right? So if you know that you are being watched, you behave in certain ways in order to avoid whatever consequences may result from your flouting of particular rules. So the fact that we carry around these devices that surveil us, like, how does that affect the sense of who we are? If we are modifying our behaviors, we are modifying how we act in public. Like, aren't we also in some sense losing who we are, the kind of things that make us weird and uniquely us? And aren't we all kind of just sort of merging and becoming very similar to one another? So those are the questions that I think a novel is really a perfect place to think through that and to see what might happen. It's like a simulation.
It is, but it's a really good simulation. And sort of the first thing that Sarah says when she gets to this facility, and how are we referring to this? I mean, my first thought was, oh, she's incarcerated. But the body that is incarcerating her would not describe it as incarceration. So I want to spend a few minutes with you on this, because I'm sorry, if you are held in a place,
Mm-hmm.
technically against your will, that to me is that is the technical definition of incarceration. So the idea that a body or an organization or a company could decide that the semantics actually are just wrong.
Yeah.
Can we play with language for a second?
Yeah. I mean, I did that deliberately, as you might guess. I thought that, first of all, the nature of her infraction is hypothetical. She might commit a crime. And I felt that if we are in the world of pre-crime, it wouldn't make sense for me to send my character into a prison, but rather I wanted her to be in an in-between place where she is neither guilty nor innocent. And I kept thinking, well, how would I convey that? She is detained. What's another word I could use? And I thought, oh, how about if I use retained, which seems a bit more innocuous, a bit less threatening. And that opened up, for me, this way of thinking about how we cage individuals beyond the sort of form of the prison. So thinking more broadly about places like sanatoriums, reformatories, mental hospitals, just all kinds of places where we put humans because we sense that they are like outsiders, or that they, in some cases have committed crimes, but in many, many cases have not committed crimes. And yet they are kind of held in confinement. Mm-hmm. And so I developed language around that retention center to make it seem less clearly a prison and more one of those things, one of those places where you're told, oh, it's just going to be 3 weeks. Right. Why are you so opposed to this? Like, surely if there is any risk that you might harm your husband, which is the right. I think we can safely say that.
Yeah, that doesn't quite feel like a spoiler. Yeah, we have a sleep deprived new mother.
Yeah. Who's the first possible victim, do you think? Surely if that is a risk, then you would be okay with being held under observation for 21 days, which is how it starts.
The sense of claustrophobia is pretty intense. The sense of dislocation and sort of disjointedness. The characters' movements are limited. Their connection to the outside world is limited. And so their understanding of what's happening around them is controlled, contained, not available to them as it would be for anyone else sort of moving in the world. And I still didn't want to leave, though. It wasn't so uncomfortable that I was like, oh, because, sometimes you need to take a little break while you're reading. And the first time I read The Dream Hotel, it was straight through. And it was, thank you very much. I am not looking at my phone. I have things to do. Because I wanted to see how you were going to take that sort of human subconscious and Sarah's personality, which was very relatable, remains very relatable, and take her where we ultimately see her. And we meet a really interesting cast of women. The bad guys are not black and white bad guys.
Yeah.
So you're doing a little bit of a high wire act with this cast. And it's not the first time that you have done that. The Other Americans, which was 2020, fall of 2020?
It was a spring of 2019.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so it was before Conditional Citizens.
That's right.
That also had rather a large cast. And I like watching how your characters come together and come apart. And there was only one moment where I was annoyed with Elias, who is Sarah's husband. And he says to her sort of offhandedly, like, why can't you just follow the rules? And I was like, my guy, you're such a great character. You're a good dad. You're a good husband. You are doing the best you can with what you have. And yet you still buy into this, like, why can't you just act like normally?
Yeah. I think that's the effect of these places. It's not just the person who is kept in confinement. It's the entire family that ends up being affected by it. And having so much on his plate, as he says, leads him to snap and say something that is really quite awful to her. And it's interesting what you say about this world and how controlled it is, because that sort of on a craft level was such a challenge. With the previous book, for example, with Other Americans, it's set in the Mojave Desert. So I have all of this landscape and I get to play with it and I can put a scene where I want it and I can have my characters move and do all kinds of things. But what do you do when your character really has a very small range of motion? And, it was such a challenge. And I had to really work very hard at coming up with ways to kind of let you forget you're in there by either having her reflect on her past, having her reflect on her shadow life, the life that she might have had if she wasn't in confinement, having her read the news so we find out a bit about what's going on in the outside world, using sort of the documents, the archival documents that are included in the book. So there were all kinds of techniques that I had to sort of deploy in order to kind of keep myself from continually reminding the reader that we are actually in confinement. We are in this facility and we're not leaving anytime soon.
There are a couple of email chains that I think a lot of us have experienced, maybe not with the same words, but it makes it very clear that freedom is not the thing that is sitting next to Sarah, that it is something to aspire for. And also she ends up being in Madison much longer than anyone expects. And it is very close to a year. And she meets
this cast of women.
She would not, these are women that she would not necessarily meet.
Yeah.
And they're a great cast. But I'm wondering if they all sort of, if you knew going into it sort of who was going to, or they just kind of showed up and you did,
They showed up because all I knew is I had her. And once I placed her inside Madison, I then set about populating that world. And so I would just start the scene. And sometimes I wouldn't even know, who's going to show up, who's going to, So it's just this process of discovery in the early drafts and with fairly radical changes in the earliest drafts between, names are changing, occupations are changing, backgrounds, what people did and how they ended up there, all of that is changing. And so I had to kind of keep track of all of them as I kept writing and revising the book.
When do you bring your editor into the process? I mean, when are you sharing pages? I know there are a lot of folks in the world who think, oh, well, you're a writer, you sit at a table, you do a thing, and then you send it off. But there is some, especially when you've worked with someone for quite a long time, there ends up being a shift in the relationship. And I don't know how that impacts your work, but I'm wicked curious.
Yeah. Not with this book. I don't know. So let's just see. So with this book, I went through, I would say, probably 4 complete drafts, maybe even 5.
Okay.
Before I showed it to, I need to make sure I have the whole thing is actually my vision, what I actually want. Everything is where I need it to be. And then my agent took it to Pantheon, and my editor there, who's Errol McDonald, had left. He had gone over to Knopf. And so she took it to Naomi Gibbs.
Who's great.
And so Naomi, who's great. We love Naomi. So she read the book. And what was interesting about her editorial comments was basically having a really smart reader who's asking you, well, wait a minute, why, if your character is really this person who has this history background, right? And she's working as an archivist and she's doing all of this. Why is she doing this extremely basic thing on page 30?
Right.
And I think, oh, okay, so this isn't working. And then I have to, go back and rewrite. So I actually ended up thanks to Naomi's comments, rewriting probably that entire first, like the first 90 pages where we kind of get like how everything is working, kind of like world building, fine tuning how you find out how this world is working. And what I ended up doing, and this is where Professor of Creative Writing ends up being really helpful, is I ended up teaching a seminar on kind of like how to open novels. And so I taught a class where I selected this reading list, and then I studied, and I just by forcing myself to actually lecture every week about all these different novels, it helped me, and how the world building happened in these novels, it helped me to go back to mine and kind of rework it so that I could answer Naomi's queries and deliver something smart. And so I did that and turned in my revision to her, and then we did line edits after that.
Right. Okay. But can I ask what a little bit of the reading, not the whole reading list, but
yes,
what are some of the books off of the reading list that you used to teach that opening the novel class? Now my eyes are getting big. Because,
I know.
This is exciting. But I just, it seems like the possibilities are kind of endless, but obviously if you're teaching a semester, you kind of have to make decisions.
Yeah. Well, one of these books was actually one of Naomi's books. It's The Memory Police. I think it's Naomi's book, The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa, which, oh my God, Miwa, like how relevant is that? Oh my God. Let me tell you, I actually probably had sold so many copies of that book. I have recommended it to so many people. But so that was one, right? Because we are on this island. We are entering this world where people are basically told they can't use certain concepts. They are forced to forget certain concepts and the words to express them. So how do you convey that to the reader? And so that was one. But then I did also things like historical novels, like, do you like True History of the Kelly Gang by Peter Carey?
Oh, I haven't read that I read it a million years ago, but I know, I absolutely understand why that's part of the class.
Yeah, so I love that one. So historical novels like that and speculative. I'm trying to remember because this is like a couple of years ago. But anyway, the point is that by actually kind of really thinking through it in a formal context, I found that was in combination with Naomi's comments, like helped me in revising that section. And then I revised the rest of it. And then we went to line edits.
It does also make me think of something you said very specifically about the Moor's account, which was your third book. It was the novel that was a finalist for the Pulitzer. And it's historical fiction. And the way you decided which words to keep, it's a very sort of Hilary Mantel, Wolf Hall kind of presentation. And so if you're a fan of that trilogy, please
I love
go
Hilary
find
Mantel,
right? Place of Greater Safety, actually. Her French Revolution novel is also a book that I love.
I haven't read that one. Wow.
It's not small, I will say that, but the characters are fantastic.
Yeah, she's great.
And the language is great. But I love this idea that you can take language that we use in the present day, and of course, I don't have an example right at my fingertips, but you can use language that we use in the present day that was also used in the 16th century.
Yes.
That there is that continuation. And yes, language is meant to evolve and change and represent, like, I love language and the fact that it changes. But I also really like the idea that you can make something that's part of a historical record sound fresh simply by tweaking your word choices. Yeah. And she's a great example of that. And so in working with the Moor's account, the sort of the question of diction comes up. Like, how do you find the right word choices that, are legible to us? I mean, they're basically words that we use today, but actually were already in wide circulation in the 16th century. So it feels appropriate to the era without feeling actually literally from that era, because I'm not sure many people would want to read that. And so actually, while we're on the subject of historical novels, I think that that's something that they have in common with speculative novels, right? Because you're entering a world that none of your readers have lived through. Right. And you have to create and convey very convincingly that they are in this world and that you know it, you hold it between your hands and you have to convey that. And that's a challenge. I just love that. I love that as a challenge. It's fun to read too, because I mean, it's kind of, it when you see it, which How analytical is that? Saying, well,
Yeah.
I buy into the world or I don't.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I really appreciate about the Dream Hotel is, even though at one point I felt like you dropped sort of a time clue, and it was sort of like, is this like 2050? Is this I think you know where I'm referring to, but I will drop it there so we don't accidentally give something up. But at the same time, it feels very sort of, it could be happening right now.
Yes.
It could also be happening in the future, but it could have also been the very recent past.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels sort of, because the tech is all recognizable, and the women are recognizable, and the way they relate to the world is recognizable. And Elias, and certainly the rest of Sarah's family and her children
Mm-hmm.
and whatnot, like everyone is who they are.
Mm-hmm.
But humans are kind of remarkably consistent.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's one of the things that when I was working on the Moor account, for example, right? These people were off the rockers. What were you thinking? Reading a document to an empty beach, telling the people that you are now their new lords and masters. Like, what is going on here? But then you look, at the kinds of documents that, for example, John Yoo was producing when he was part of the Bush administration. And you're like, oh, wait, I see. These documents are actually meant to protect the invaders, essentially. And that really, really brought home for me how much of, our the human heart really doesn't change across all these centuries, right? So you have the same emotions. You have jealousy, you have love, you have hate, you have desire, ambition. And if you focus on those in writing the book, then it becomes real for the reader, even if the era is completely different than the one we're in right now.
I mean, I never once felt like I was off kilter in a way where I was being pulled out of the narrative. I was always grounded. And that, as you can imagine, I read a lot and I have many opinions about things that don't always make it onto the show. But to be able to stay grounded in a fantastical narrative, right? Because the narrative tension in Dream Hotel and the pacing is really fantastic. I mean, you're dropping back and forth, cutting back and forth between past and present. Little hint at the future, but past and present mostly. But all of these family relationships, all of the relationships between the women and whatnot. And you have to be careful with pacing when you're juggling all of those parts, because I never once felt like I was hanging out with someone too long, or that I only got a snippet. It was just like, it was always just right. And then I got to the next piece. And early in the book, you're saying, when people get to Madison, when the women get to Madison, the first thing they have to adjust to is time. And that's kind of exactly how I feel about reading novels. Like, the first thing you have to adjust to really is how time moves, and how it moves for the characters, but also how it moves for you as a reader. And it's going to be different with every book.
Yeah. And it's interesting because in thinking through speculative novels, like this particular speculative novel, the question of time came up right away, right? Yeah. Because so much of what we have sacrificed in terms of privacy has to do with trying to maximize our use of time. It's a very capitalistic drive. Like, I have to produce and I have to work and I have to do all these things. And in order to get there, then I have to master time. I have to own it. And that's one of the reasons in conceiving of this device that Sarah has in the book, this sleep device.
Right.
That's one of the reasons why I chose to make it a device that basically helps you to have a full night's rest on just 4 to 5 hours of actual sleep. Because I'm convinced that were such a device on the market, it would immediately, regardless of privacy concerns, start selling. Because we have all bought into this idea that we own time. We have to use it as efficiently as possible, and that's such a dangerous thing. We're people. We're not. we have to move with time. We're not in control of time. So,
but I think too, especially recently, the value, the financial costs and benefits of time and the way people approach it, right? Like, is this worth my time? Do I want to spend my time doing this? And one of the things that Sarah discovers while she's incarcerated is that she suddenly has time to read again. And I had to sit with that line for a while. I was like, oh. But I mean, if you're chasing after toddlers and you're working and you have a life and you're caring for a parent and doing all of the things that so many people are doing in this moment, it is very hard to capture time in a way that you might want to use it, as in sit down and read a book. I mean, this is, I've heard this from countless friends who have survived the toddler years and suddenly they can read again. And I totally respect.
Yeah.
Watching the characters deal with time is one thing, but, and I meant to say this a little earlier when we were first talking about dreams at the top of the show, but the idea of dreams being a commodity. Yes. Right. Like, and I'm so happy you chose that word commodity, because I was like, oh, that's exactly what it is. But it's so invasive. It's so invasive. And yet, you know, and I think you said this somewhere else in the book that, you know, obviously dreams can change the world, which is great. But the way your characters experience the commodification of dreams, and you can start with the American dream, right? Like the original American myth that, you know, that might be an entirely separate conversation. But commodifying dreams.
Yeah. So basically, when I was thinking through this book and thinking how I was going to use this idea of data collection with dreams, I went back to think about the early days of the internet.
Yeah.
Right. So we remember those days when we first discovered we were using, do you remember Yahoo and Alta Vista? And then you had to use, and then suddenly Google appeared and we're like, oh, this one works so much better. The results are so much better. So Google, of course, started as a search engine, and its claim to fame was that it was going to give you better results because of the page ranking technology that Larry Page and Sergey Brin had devised while graduate students at Stanford. But of course, a couple of years into it, they discover, and one of their engineers actually discovers that by looking at what people are searching and where they're going, we're actually learning things about people. And lo and behold, we could use that information and sell them ads. And so in a way, they commodified people's online searches. And that's how it begins, and that's how it began. And so when I was thinking about the journey from there, so roughly around the year 2000 to 2020, roughly 2020, so that's 20 years, right? How much of our data has been commodified and sold? Then it became, for me, when I was thinking about dreams, I thought they have to, like, it doesn't matter what device comes on the market, like the data that it produces will be commodified and extracted. So one of the things that I tried to do in the book is kind of connect the world of the future, right? The commodification of this data with past commodifications that have happened in different times in history, right? So thinking, for example, of the most obvious one is during the sort of colonial era, right? Where these imperial powers would come into a country, lay claim to it, and suddenly they're mining gold or diamonds or, you know. And the same thing is happening with these data companies. They are laying claim to our data and deciding to do things with it and monetizing it and mining it. And even the word mining is the same, you see? So just applying that to the world of dreams, what would I be able to do with it? And that was kind of one of the fun things to do during the writing of the book, to kind of follow that idea.
I mean, I love that you were able to have fun with it, and I certainly had fun with it reading, but at the same time, part of me is slightly horrified by how willingly we sort of give up pieces of ourselves that used to be deeply private. And in some ways, yay, you get to build a community and you get to find your people, and that's terrific. But at the same time, living online has sort of an emotional and psychic toll that we also see the backside of in the Dream Hotel because of the way information is controlled and what happens to people. And I'm kind of hoping in a way that the Dream Hotel kicks off some of those conversations as well, where it's like, well, what are we willing to sacrifice?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's also, my hope is it's if we are going to have these conversations, which is, we should all be terrified about, the amount of data that these companies are collecting, but that's not exactly a new insight, to be terrified of that data collection. What I think is much more interesting is to think about what happens after that.
Yeah.
Like how do we react to that? And in the book, it takes her a while. When she arrives in the facility, she thinks, first of all, this is a mistake, and I need to be, released as soon as possible. And then it's like, well, I just have to do my 21 days. And so it takes her a while because she really believes herself to be at a remove from the other people in the facility. Yeah. And it's only through learning that she actually is the same as everyone, and that she has to build relationships and build connections within that sort of community inside that retention center. Those efforts in the book, I think my hope is that if people are going to have those conversations, it's around those efforts. It's around that. How do we move past our terror? Terror is narratively fun,
right?
But beyond that, where is it going to lead us?
But that's one of the reasons I read fiction, is to be transported to a place that may not look like, my street that way kind of thing. Right. But to be able to start conversations about whatever present moment we're in or how we relate to what came before us. I mean, I love the fact that Sarah is an archivist. I mean, how many archivists do you actually meet in fiction at all? But I mean, she's kind of like, well, I love the past because it helps me give me context for the present. And I think there are a lot of folks who don't necessarily think about history that way. And they don't think, or they think the recent past is, 8 million years ago. And it's like, well, actually, it is much closer than you think. And I love watching her sort of make sense of what she knows as context. Yeah. And also this new world she has to navigate with these women who, again, she would not have come into connection with otherwise, but ultimately ends up having, pretty great relationships.
Yeah. I mean, I loved building this community of women and seeing them interact with one another. And one of the reasons that I was so enamored with all of them is because it really also opened up a way of talking about the surveillance of women apart from technology. Yes, of course, we are all subject to surveillance, but I think that surveillance is not neutral, right? It's not just affecting everybody the same. Yes, everybody's data is being collected. We know that, but men are not surveilled to the same extent as women. And the effect of surveillance is not the same on men and women. You can just look at all the studies that are coming out about teen girls and what's happening to their sense of self-esteem. And so being in this world of women, it just was a nice way to connect this technological surveillance system with other systems of control. For example, the global patriarchal order, or, so it was I had fun with that. I had fun with their relationships and the ways where they sometimes cooperate, but sometimes also kind of come into conflict with one another, and the sort of the continual push and pull between individual interest and then the community interest, and seeing those two come into contact. And it really made me realize that, survival is not something that can happen for an individual. It can only happen for a community.
I don't know. Maybe it's a really Asian idea, right? That the community comes first no matter what kind of thing. But I think you can have both. And maybe that's, American me saying you can have both. But I think that every one of us brings our own sort of perspective, right? Like you're reading a book, you and I may be reading the same book. We may not have the exact same response because as much as there's overlap between us, there are also like you're you, I'm me. We're going to bring our own experience to reading a book.
Yeah.
But I love the idea that Sarai is constantly sort of challenged. Her expectations are challenged. The other characters' expectations are challenged. And no one really gets to be complacent. Like, I'm even thinking of her dad, who is very of his time, like, Caltech engineer, like he's dad. Dad has many feelings about things. And dad might be right about some stuff and dad might be super wrong about other stuff, but he's a great character. And he's absolutely believable as her dad. But he's also a dude of his time, his place and everything else, right? And so watching these expectations be challenged or change or whatever it is, there's nothing I like more than watching characters have their eyes opened.
Yeah, that's great. I'm so glad to hear that. That's really great.
And I really do feel like everyone gets their arc. Everyone gets their moment. Even there's do we call him a guard? What is Hinton? Like, is he?
He's the senior attendant.
Thank you, senior attendant.
Oh, Hinton. Oh, I should talk to you about Hinton because remember when we were talking about the editorial comments, this was one of the notes I had gotten from Naomi was about him because in earlier drafts, he was meaner. Well, he's still mean, but like he was somebody who I had almost, because he was sort of like the antagonist, I had kind of really made him the antagonist and she really, like, her notes helped me see that I had gone too far and I had to kind of make him more of an interesting character. And in doing my revisions, I had so much fun with his character and figuring out, like, how does a guy end up working a job like this? What's his story? Because one of the things too is that when people have a certain amount of power, but they are in charge of a small environment,
right?
They love to deploy that power. We've all experienced.
Oh yes,
that.
We have.
Yes.
Yes, we have.
He's a person like that. Like he's actually just a small time attendant in this. Like he's really not a super powerful guy, but within the confines of this retention center, he is the big boss, and so he intends on using the power that he has.
You were talking about it earlier too, the devices of using, the email chains, or there's some documentation, and I will allude to it that way, but there's some documentation, corporate documentation, where it's really clear that even the people who think they have power don't really have power. And I love that. And again, it goes back to subverting expectations. And again, as a reader, I like to have my expectations subverted. I like to be surprised by what characters are going to do. And actually, Hinton does have a moment where it's like,
yeah. Not what you expected.
Yeah, didn't do the thing I thought. Sarah and I were both convinced he'd done a thing, and he had, in fact, not done a thing. So,
yeah. I mean, I think those moments are really important in creating character. Like, basically, if your character is always doing exactly what you expect them to do, then that actually doesn't make them human. You have, in creating, like, really complicated characters, you have to have contradiction almost in how they behave. And that makes them more convincing.
And I know we talked about the class that you taught about opening the novel, but you as a reader, I feel like you're reading for voice first.
Yeah.
And that has to be the thing. And if stuff happens, great. But I mean, reading for voice is absolutely what has driven your creative process and engages you when you're not working.
Yeah. I think that, like, point of view, it's funny. I was just reading somebody online saying how point of view was such an important part of revision. And I think it's the most important part. Like, we read because we are looking for a perspective. We are looking for someone's story. So having the right perspective, the right voice, the right tone, the right language register, the right level of formality, all of these decisions at the level of language matter a great deal. And they don't necessarily come immediately in the writing process. It does, it can take some experimentation, some drafting and redrafting to settle on just the right level, but knowing already whose story you're going to tell through exactly what perspective is key. It's a key part for me for writing.
Is that what made you put down The Dream Hotel in 2014? I mean, you put 2 other books out into the world, the collection of essays, Conditional Citizens in 2020, and The Other Americans novel in 19. That's a lot of writing while you're sort of cooking The Dream Hotel.
Yeah. So what happened was it's exactly as you say. In 2014, when I had the idea, I started working on it. The voice wasn't right. The character I had, so think about it this way. I had the idea, the premise, right? And I was like, oh, I know exactly how to make it real. I'm going to invent this device that does all this thing for sleep. Oh, okay. So then that means that the story is going to begin in this tech company where the device is first put on the market. And so having a character who, by the way, at that time was a man.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
But because it's a tech company, it's an engineer, all that. But the voice wasn't quite right. And on top of that, it was being in the Silicon Valley setting just wasn't working for me. I had actually, after I finished my PhD, I went to work for a software startup company.
Oh.
Yeah, before I published my first book.
Oh, I think I did not know that. I knew you had the PhD. I did not know you had worked at a startup.
Yeah, I did. So I was kind of familiar with that culture, and I used some of that in this book. But I honestly, being in that world almost gave me PTSD to write about, and the voice wasn't working. And I was like, I'm going to set this one aside, and I'm going to work on the other story that I have an idea for. And so I spent the next 4 to 5 years, I can't remember, doing The Other Americans.
Okay.
The collection of essays came out in between. And then in 2020, I picked up the manuscript again and started. That's why, starting with the character of Sarah was so important, because having that character, then I knew what language, what tone to use for this story, where to place it. And then I was ready to go, ready to.
And one of the things I really like about Sarah, too, is this tension between her being an outsider and yet not being an outsider. She thinks she's more of an outsider than she actually is.
Mm-hmm.
Like the things that she's sort of wrestling with, some of those sort of larger ideas that she's wrestling with while she's in Madison. It was really interesting to watch her puzzle through this stuff, because she was so sure that she was kind of like doing all of the things. And I'm like, well, okay, what's next? Where are you taking me? And just watching her sort of puzzle through was really... Did you surprise yourself a lot as you were writing Dream Hotel?
Yes. And what was really surprising to me was how the opening for the book didn't change through the 9 drafts that I wrote, and that knowing that there is this sort of new resident that arrives, I think we can say that, and realizing, I knew where that was going. And so there were parts, but not in specifics, but not in, I was just like, this person is interesting. Something's going to happen with this person, but I didn't know what. So finding, solutions and finding pathways and going in different directions with the story. That's the joy of writing. It's like exploring, not knowing. And sometimes it doesn't work and you have to cut, 30 pages or 50 pages, and that's fine. But that kind of exploration is what I think that's the joy.
Well, and the idea too that the opening survives 9 drafts, and then you just go back and fine tune it. I was like, okay.
Oh, if I told you, Miwa, the first line, I was changing that almost all the way until then we went into copy edits, and then I had to stop. The opening paragraphs matter to me so much, because that is how you're going to this is the reader's first entry into this world. So it has to be appropriate tone-wise, theme-wise, everything has to kind of, it's almost like the novel in capsule form. So
I'm glad this is the opening line you settled on, though. I just, again, I had so much pleasure reading a book that also, pushed me in ways that that's the joy of a novel for me.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I don't really want to just fly through something just to fly through a text.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to sort of be poked at a little bit. And it's like, well, what do you really think? What do you really think? What do you genuinely believe? Like, and also realizing that I'm not necessarily the same at the end of something I've read. Like, that to me is kind of like, where else do you get that? I don't really get that from other art forms.
Yeah. And what's great about this particular art form is that the questions that it gave rise to for you and the images that created in your brain, nobody else has access to that yet. It's all private. It's all private to you. And it's such an intimate art form, right? Like, you read those squiggly things on a page and now you have a story in your head that is similar, but not what the story as I have it in my head, and not the way that another reader is going to have it in their head. And it's just such a beautiful thing that we can construct these worlds. It's just amazing.
It is. And then to go back and reread later, I mean, I don't know how I'm going to feel about the Dream Hotel in 5 years or 10 years. I do know at some point I will reread it because I have the luxury of being able to do that.
Yeah, that's great.
And it's just, you know, watching your relationship to a book change, or characters change, or maybe not. I mean, there are other things where I picked up and I'm like, oh yeah, okay, great. I'm reading you for sentences because, yeah, these characters, oh, right, okay. Sometimes you just read for language. Can I ask if you're working on a new thing?
Not yet, because I've just been, you know, so busy with turning in the book and traveling, and then we had to move, and it's just so it's, you know, so I haven't. And, you know, everybody says, oh, you should already have another book started by the time this one begins. And I'm like, no, it's never worked for me. I've always kind of like finished and released and promoted and then settled down. And there is kind of a fallow period between books. And I've learned to accept that this is it. So no writing right now. I am writing a review, but I'm not, you know, writing any fiction or anything.
I like that fallow period analogy, because I get to read what you do after the fallow piece. So whatever you're doing, please continue to do that, because then I get to read the really great books that come out of it. So I appreciate it so much. I could leave it right there, but you know what? I have one question that I know listeners are going to have, and I think it's a great place for us to sort of end the conversation, which is, there are going to be people who say, why speculative fiction? Like, are you just buying into a moment? And honestly, I can see where they're coming from, but at the same time, like, I see the connection to the earlier work. So I'm going to ask you to riff on it for a bit.
Yeah. Well, let me just address the whole idea about the moment. I mean, as we've discussed already, that this was a book that I started thinking about way back in 2014. So it's been in my head for 10 years. I started working on it during the Obama administration. I wrote the bulk of it during the Biden administration. I had no idea it was going to come out into this particular moment, shall we say. So that was that. And then as far as like why speculative fiction and what it has in common with the previous work, I would say that all of these novels, all of my work that I've put out is really exploring this experience of estrangement, of feeling like an outsider, whether it is, for example, with the Moor's account, an enslaved man from Morocco who is swept up into this huge, you know, Spanish colonial expedition and brought to the New World. And he's neither a conquistador, nor is he a Native American. And so he's just kind of like this outsider guy who's just observing these two cultures come into a clash with one another. And then with this book, it's kind of, you know, this person who gets this device that she thinks is going to help her sleep, and is in essence having her sense of self taken away from her by the company. And so it is exploring the sense of estrangement. It's also exploring how an individual continues to survive under extremely powerful systems that visit massive predations on human beings. So it's really kind of like these bigger themes, but of course, in terms of the type of novels they are, you know, for example, contemporary or historical or speculative, that's the fun of it. I honestly get bored if I do the same thing over and over. So if I need an idea to excite me, and I need characters that I can believe in and I can have in my head for 5 years, so they have to be exciting also. So when I find those things, then I just move forward. I'm not too concerned about, how different the novels are going to be.
I mean, honestly, I've been reading you since the first book, and it never would have occurred to me to even sort of say, hey, you tried a genre thing. It's like, no, just reading Laila. It's cool. I'll follow you anywhere. It's good.
How sweet of you. Thanks so much. Thank you, Miwa.
Listen, you're a pleasure to read. I'm so glad we got to do this interview. And, I'm really excited for readers to hit the Dream Hotel. So thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.